title of this message is Biblical Wisdom from Secular Neighbors. Biblical Wisdom from Secular Neighbors. Now, some of you know I grew up on a farm in Minnesota. My great-grandfather homesteaded it and helped build the little neighborhood one-room country schoolhouse that I attended when I was a little kid, and my brother. And so it's been around for a long time, a German community. Almost everybody spoke some level of German. And 3 miles away, there was a Danish community and, little communities. And they all had their little, where you take milk to the local creamery and such. And everybody knew everybody else. It's just the way it was. You grew up with them. There were hardly any girls in the neighborhood where I grew up. Almost all baby boomers came home from World War II, and they had little boys for some reason. Very few girls. Girls were just those wondrous creatures that we saw floating around somewhere, but we didn't know anything about them. Well, this message is really part 2 of a 2-part series. And I know it's unusual to give part 2 before I give part 1, but that's just the way it is. So at some point, we'll get around to part 1. I do want to mention that there's at least 8 times in the Bible where we're instructed to love our neighbors as ourselves. We read that first in Leviticus 19:18. Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And to have this repeated, it goes to Matthew 19:19, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. These are important admonitions. So we always find this loving your neighbor as yourself. So today I want to talk about some of my neighbors. And I got to thinking about my neighbors in the pioneering farm community where I grew up. And the neighboring families all knew each other for generations by the time I came along. And so I'm going to review then 12 biblical lessons that were pronounced or learned from my neighbors. Now, and these are lessons that were demonstrated by examples in everyday life. Now, they didn't go to God's church. They were a mixture of Lutheran, at least one Catholic, and one Seventh-day Adventist. Excuse me, I have to say Lutheran because Germans didn't pronounce a TH. And so I'm going to use their real names because these stories are 50, 60 years ago, and these people are all gone now, so they can't come back on me. But I do want to tell you about Eddie Miller. He's the first one. We all called him Big Eddie. You can imagine why we called him Big Eddie, because he's bigger than anybody else you know. But Big Eddie had a heart of gold, and when he was a young man, he told about this story. All of the neighbors, they cooperate during harvest season. This was back in early days. They didn't have a lot of mechanization. So all the neighbors got together, and they would go from place to place for harvesting. And they cooperated, so you'd go harvest one place, and then the group neighbors would go to the next place and harvest. So they worked cooperatively. And there was an occasion, Big Eddie said, in the 1930s, and all the neighbor farmers had gathered together and work as a group to harvest. And day after day, they would do their morning chores at home, feed their livestock, and then go at the next farm that needed to be harvested until all of the harvesting in the neighborhood was complete. Well, one day, Big Eddie tells that 2 men got into a disagreement. I know it's hard to believe that people don't agree all the time, but they got into a disagreement, and one man just insisted on an argument, and the other fellow just refused to argue. And yet the more contentious fellow pursued the matter. He was intent on provoking a fight. The fellow who refused to argue or fight simply put down his tools, his equipment, and he walked home about a mile away. The next day, new day, both farmers showed up for the cooperative harvest crew. Well, the next day had come. They had all slept, and the issue was diffused. Things looked different the next day, and cooler heads prevailed. If we turn to Proverbs 15, verse 1, I'm going to do this in several different translations. Proverbs 15-1. In the King James Version, a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. In the complete Jewish Bible, it says in Proverbs 15:1, a gentle response deflects fury, but harsh words makes tempers rise. Or in the contemporary English version, a kind answer soothes angry feelings, but harsh words stir them up. The farmer that walked away didn't want to get into a fight or an argument. He just went home. And so the lesson for this first example that Big Eddie told, a soft answer turns away wrath. Learning to say something in a soft and kind way so that you can avoid contention. Now, Big Eddie was a custom farmer. It means he had certain pieces of equipment that nobody else could really afford on their own. So he was one of those that bought these big harvesting pieces of equipment, but then he would go around and custom harvest to other farmers, and they would pay him a fee because they couldn't afford their own big harvesting equipment. And so he was, now Big Eddie was a big fellow. He couldn't climb up into a combine or a harvester himself. We took a tractor and a loader and lifted him up. I guess he was somewhere, I'm going to guess, 450 pounds or more. And he took a lunchbox up with him, and he was up there for the day, up in the equipment, and got him down later. Well, my dad hired Big Eddie every September to bring equipment over to make corn silage to fill our silos. And the corn was chopped in the field and then hauled in wagons to the farmstead. And then we put it, the wagons would mechanize feed into a machine called a blower, like a fan, a horizontal fan, but it would blow up the silage up a tube up into the silo. Well, we had 4 silos on the farm, lots of corn, hundreds of acres, so we had a lot of work. My brothers and I were teenagers, so we drove tractors and we hauled these silage wagons. We're all 4 teenagers at the same time, and taking the full wagons from the field, bring them home and empty them, take the empty ones back, and Big Eddie would be filling them up one after the other all day long. Well, one day, during silo filling season, my dad was driving a tractor, pulling an empty wagon back to the field. And he was going on it was a slow downgrade, and the field road was a little bumpy, dirt road, and the hitch pin popped out. And because he was going slightly downhill, the wagon was catching up with the tractor. And what happens, the wagon then started riding up the wheels on the tractor. And my dad had the presence of mind to see what was happening behind him. And on the moving tractor, I'm going to guess it's up to 15 miles an hour, which is pretty fast when you got a tractor and a wagon. And so he jumped off diagonally forward off the tractor over the wheel. He was younger then, so were we. And then the crash occurred where the wagon rode up the back wheels, and it took the seat of the tractor and folded it up into the steering wheel. Had he been there, he'd have been dead. But he escaped. He jumped off first. Well, and it was a good thing that he saw that, and he was able to jump. A lot of farmers weren't built that is physically able to do that, but he did. The entire work crew stopped silo filling, had to get the wagon box down off from the top of a tractor, an empty box, had to bring it to repair the tractor, repair the wagon box, and now no progress was made that morning toward filling the silo. And as was the custom, the host family, which was the Martens farm, served lunch to the work crew. So whoever hosted the harvest, they'd serve a dinner. So my mom made a huge dinner for everybody. But Big Eddie held a meeting of everybody that was there before going to the house. And he said, say absolutely nothing to my mother, and don't say anything to any of other neighbors either, because we don't need to spread the news about a near-death experience that just occurred. One of the men drove to the near town, bought safety hitch pins that couldn't pop out. Everybody was equipped with those from that point forward. Everybody was sobered by the thought it could have happened to them. And they all knew that very few of them would have the reflexes to have jumped off the tractor and survived. To my knowledge, for the next 53 years of her life, my mother never heard about this accident because everybody kept their mouth shut, okay? And Big Eddie didn't want to cause distress in the family or among the neighbors or the neighbors' wives, because all the wives would be a little worried about the husbands going and not coming home again. And so to say anything would have not have served a good purpose. In Proverbs 17, verse 9, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. I don't know that Big Eddie ever read the Bible, but the principle was there. He didn't want to repeat a matter that would not be helpful, that would separate friends, cause problems. So lesson 2 is, don't miss a good opportunity to keep your mouth shut. Real simple. I remember my dad saying that from time to time when somebody made a comment, and he would say privately, he missed a good opportunity to keep his mouth shut. So I remember that one. Example number 3 was Cliff Benson. He wasn't German, but he moved into the neighborhood. He was lived in the city all of his life, and then in middle age, he decided, because he was raised when as a little boy on the farm, he wanted to go back and act like a farmer. Some of you have seen Green Acres on TV, where a city guy pretended to be a farmer. Well, that was sort of like Cliff, but he didn't really know how to be a farmer. He had a traveling sales job, so he was gone a lot. He rented some of his farm to the Martens family. He tried to raise livestock, calves and feeder steers, but he didn't have the knowledge or the machinery or the know-how to really do the job. And he often came over to talk to my dad and get advice. What do I do? How do I do it? And one day he came out while my dad's planting soybeans in a nice tilled field, and he's wearing his city shoes, not work boots, walking in the soft soil, and he comes out and he asks my dad, "How deep do you plant soybeans?" And my dad said with a straight face, he said, "About 1 inch above the ground." Now, my dad inherited his sense of humor from me, and Cliff went, and then went home. Just to give you the idea, he just wasn't altogether clear as to the details of being farming. I mean, regular farmers all know you plant soybeans very shallow, so just enough the dirt to cover. Beans sprout up quickly, roots go down, the sprouts go up. Cliff was always borrowing machinery from his neighbors. He only had one little tractor. And the neighbors were generous. They could use something here or something there. But it was at neighborhood gatherings and 4-H meetings, and or at a neighborhood picnic or a farm auction, and people would talk, and they discovered Cliff didn't have any machinery. He would borrow select pieces from different neighbors, and they would all compare notes. That the neighbors didn't mind if he borrowed a piece now and again, but he never had to buy much machinery this way. He just borrowed a different one from each neighbor, never too much from any one. But everybody understood that. Cliff was a city guy. Everybody lived in peace and harmony, each pursuing his own dream. Cliff's dream was to be a farmer. Well, what is our dream? And what is our hope? Psalm 71, verse 5. Psalm 71 and verse 5. And I'll read this in the Amplified version. "You are my hope, O Lord God. You are my trust from my youth and the source of my confidence." We have a hope. We have a hope of being in the family of God, in the kingdom of God. And so we have a hope. We have a goal. We have an expectation. Now, Cliff's was to be a farmer and act like a farmer. So lesson 3 is live your dreams, but place your hope and confidence in God. Live your dreams, but place your hope and confidence in God. The 4th example of neighbors was a set of twins, Ray and Ralph Geyer. Now, these twin brothers, they knew how to think big. I'm talking think big. Now, Ray built the biggest diameter silo I have ever seen, and the tallest one. I mean, we had 14 and 16 foot silo, diameter, 60 feet tall. No, that wasn't good. He built a 20-foot diameter silo and even taller. Well, most people had 30 or 40 cows. That wasn't good enough. He had 100 or 150 cows, always thinking big. Had lots of land. Ray had 5 kids, and he was still found time to serve on the local school board of directors, always thinking big. Unfortunately, Ray died after slipping on a vertical ladder climbing up the silo, and he fell over 60 feet down the silo chute, lived for 3 days and died. Left a widow with 5 kids, 17 and under. And of course, they were younger than I, but my younger brother's ages. But whenever we think of Ray, we're reminded he knew how to think big and how to make things happen. Because if there was a big idea, Ray could figure out how to pull it off. But he had a twin brother, Ralph. Ralph was also a big thinker. Ralph figured out how to turn 160 acres of swampland into good farmland. He ran drainage tubes under the land, but there was no place to drain it to because gravity still works, right? It goes downhill, but no place to drain downhill. He drained it, dug a big tank, put it underground, drained it into this tank, put a pump on there, a big sump pump, and pumped it out. 160 acres, from very little value to big value. Today, that land is worth over $10,000 an acre. Back then, it was probably a few bucks an acre because nobody saw the vision. But Ralph figured it out, and what they saw, what was seemingly impossible, they made possible. The impossible just took a little longer for them. They had ambition and drive to do what others didn't even think about. In Proverbs 29 and verse 18, Proverbs 29 and verse 18 in the King James Version, where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keeps the law, happy is he. In other words, if you've got a vision of where you want to go and what you want to do within God's law, there's an opportunity to not just thrive or survive, but thrive as well. But if you don't have vision, what's going to happen? It says the people perish. So lesson 4 is have a vision of the future. Think big, think beyond ourselves. In our case, we have to keep our eye on the prize, the pearl of great price, to accomplish the vision that God has set before us. But to do that, we must keep God's laws. The 5th example, highly memorable fellow, Walt Dake, number 5. He's an old bachelor, very quiet, kept to himself, lived on only 80 acres. And he lived very simply. And he lived that way his whole life. His small house didn't have electricity. He had no wife or kids. But he did allow himself the luxury of a dial telephone. And he did have a second luxury. He put a gasoline pump, like an old lawnmower motor, on the hand-dug well so he could pump water for himself and 1 cow. And he kept to himself. He never bothered anybody. And when he got older, he couldn't farm himself anymore. And so he would rent the land to the farmer, a neighbor farmer, on shares. The guy that did the work would give him a piece of the crop as part of the rent. Well, he was old and I was in my 20s. And one summer, the farmer that was farming his land had some hay, that a share of it went to old Walt. So I'm a young buck that could unload hay bales, so I went over there to pack hay bales into the barn. And old Walt was there showing me a little rectangular hay bale. Put this one vertically, put this one horizontally, stick this one over here. But he had 1 cow and he had to keep it alive all winter. And so he showed me where each bale went so that he could keep his cow going and milk his 1 cow by hand. Walt burned wood to keep warm in the winter. He also got free rubber tires, and he cut them up and burnt them in his wood stove in the house. The inside of the house, as you might imagine, was covered with soot. And one cold winter, Walt got sick, and he couldn't tend to his fire to keep warm. When the neighbors didn't see any tire tracks going up and down his driveway, they went to check on old Walt, and they found out old Walt was too sick to keep his wood stove going, and he couldn't keep warm. And he was lying there sick, and he had frozen his toes in the cold Minnesota winter. They hauled him off to the hospital, and his toes were amputated and part of his feet. And while he was in the hospital, he asked the hospital to call two of his neighbors. And I know them both. In fact, they're in this list. And here's an old bachelor who never spent money on anything, hardly for anybody, for anything. But he called two neighbors in, those two neighbors, and he told them where he had hidden the money in his house and all the hidden hidey places. He didn't tell one, he told two, so they could watch each other. And they retrieved his money. Old Walt didn't have any insurance. But unusual, he paid cash for his hospital visit. But he couldn't go home to take care of himself. So he lived in a nursing home, and he had squirreled away enough money for his 80 years that he was able to pay for the nursing home care for the rest of his life until death, several more years. His years and hard work had resulted in financial stability. He kept to himself. He was not a busybody. He didn't cause trouble for anybody. He just stayed home, worked hard, and was obviously very memorable to me. In 2 Thessalonians 3:11, we read, "For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, not working at all, but are busybodies." And 1 Timothy 5:13, "And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not." We're getting a message here. Idleness. Old Walt wasn't idle. He worked as long and hard as he could, took care of himself. And he didn't cause trouble. He wasn't out gossiping. 1 Peter 4:15, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody in other men's matters." Nobody could even imagine that old Walt was a troublemaker of any kind. You couldn't say he was idle. You couldn't say he was disorderly. Nobody said he messed in the affairs of other people. He worked hard, didn't live beyond his means, and he minded his own business. So lesson 5 is, live simply and tend to your own affairs, not as a busybody in other people's lives. Of course, we all know that everybody else should, what they should do, right? But we don't all have the introspection thinking of what they think we should do. But if we live simply and tend to our own affairs, it's certainly biblical. Number 6 was a neighbor named Art Otto. He was Big Eddie's son-in-law. Art was the epitome of working hard all the time. Now, he didn't bathe very often, I will say that. You could smell that, and it didn't take much. Have you ever remember the old television show called Gunsmoke, and there was a character on there named Festus? You could have switched those two around because Art looked just like Festus and acted like Festus, talked like Festus. Everybody just called him Festus. But Art had a generous heart. His generosity was never in doubt. He was always ready to help anybody. And he always woke up early one morning, every morning. And I know because I worked for him one summer in college. And during the summer, he did custom grain swathing. He had a swather. Not everybody could afford one. To cut grain, put it in rows so they could harvest the combine with the combine. Well, he needed somebody to run the swather, and I was it. He had 2 swathers. So swathing about 1,000 acres, little farms, row after row. And then the grain is in rows. It dries out in the sun in a day or 3, and then you come along and harvest it with the combine separate the straw and the chaff. One morning at 6 a.m., told you Art never got up early, the axle broke on his main swather. Everyone thought, right in the middle of harvest season, he'd be out of business. And, how are you going to get an axle, when the company was in Pennsylvania, New Holland, Pennsylvania. And poor Art was beside himself. He would let down dozens of farmers who were relying on him. I said, "It's okay, Art, I'll take care of it." I got on the phone, I arranged an air freight, a replacement axle to be shipped the same day from a factory in Pennsylvania, shipped it to the Minneapolis airport, Minnesota, or Twin Cities airport. We lost a day and a half of precious work time, and then we just kept on going as fast as we could. And Ecclesiastes 9:10 really speaks about Art. Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatever you are capable of doing with all your might. There's no work, thought, knowledge, or wisdom in the grave, which is where you are headed. That's from the English Common Bible. So, following Art's example, in lesson number 6, whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. That's what Art did. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. The 7th neighbor, an example, was Ed Deesterhave. Ed lived about a mile away. He was the township government board chairman. And he was very diligent at following the law to make sure everything was done right. He spoke that way, he thought that way, everybody knew it, everybody trusted him. He was the one that made sure that all the rural road signs were in place. I remember in high school I said, that sign that's on the end of a T road, and the T road sign, it's at the end of the T. I said, according to my school class on driver instruction, the T sign is supposed to be back a ways on one road, showing that it'll come to a stop, and then a two-way arrow on the other road. Boom, changed it just like that when he found out that was the law or the expectation of traffic. But he was very meticulous about his public service. And now, being a local elected official was an unpaid job. But he was well thought of by his neighbors. Everybody respected his hand on a local government. Township government was like a city council, but all rural. And he was reelected year after year for many years. Ed was a bit of a heavy-set fellow. An older fellow, he purchased a riding lawnmower. And the engine was behind the lawnmower seat. It was an old-style engine. You have to start it using a pull rope. And so he pulled the rope, and the engine started. But Ed had forgotten that he had left the mower in gear, riding mower, when he started the engine. When he shut it off, and it started going. Well, old Ed kind of ran along the mower. He's kind of got to catch this moving mower that he's gotten started now. And he threw a leg over the mower, and he hopped onto the seat. But the mower kept going, and he misjudged the distance. And he threw his, and he landed with a thud behind the lawnmower seat and directly on top of a spark plug where 2,000 volts filled his bottom side and left him bleeding on the ground. It was a tragic situation. He was in agony. They hauled him off to the hospital, 17 stitches and a liquid diet for over a month in utter agony. But harvest season was coming up. What was he to do? He couldn't farm. And so farming had to go on. So Ed couldn't do his own farm work. He was stuck in bed at home. All of the neighbors went over to his farm, and everybody brought their equipment. Now, I was already gone from home, but my brother went over. They harvested his entire farm in one day. They brought trucks, tractors, harvesting equipment. Everybody had deep respect for old Ed. Every neighbor joined in to harvest the crops and finish all the fall tilling on Ed's farm. Old Ed was well blessed in his recovery because even though he was in the hospital and then recovering and couldn't work, everything got taken care of. In Genesis 26 and verse 4, we read about Abraham being blessed. in Genesis 26 and verse 4. The New King James, I will make your descendants, this is about Abraham, multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give to your descendants all of these lands, and in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. See, Abraham was blessed for keeping God's commandments, and the blessings continued on to his descendants, to the whole earth, and we are the recipients of those blessings even today. We have in John 14, in verses 15 and 21, if you love me, keep my commandments. If he loves me, will be loved by the Father. John 15:10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. In other words, there is a relationship, the blessings with doing what God expects of us. Ed was doing his level best to fulfill the expectations of his neighbors, to follow the local laws. I don't know that he ever knew much about God's laws, but he was rising to the expectations set before him, and everyone respected it. So lesson number 7 that we can derive from this is diligently follow the law all the time. Lesson 7, diligently follow the law all the time. Example number 8 was a fellow named Stemple Johnson. Never heard that name before, used before or after that first name of Stemple. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, and everybody knew that because they knew Friday, when the evening came, his tractor headed home. He wasn't in the fields. In the pioneer farming, there was a local creamery about every 6 miles, so no farmer had to go more than 3 miles in a horse and buggy to take your milk to market. And so, and at the creamery, they would separate the cream from the milk. And the cream was churned into butter and shipped off to the city. And the local creamery operator expected all the farmers to bring clean milk to the creamery. And everyone had the big milk cans. And farmers brought their full milk cans to the creamery, and they emptied the milk. Then they had their cans washed out with steaming hot water, a lot of boiling water at the creamery, and took the cans home. But Stemple Johnson had a reputation for dirty milk. He was dumping out his milk, and there was straw coming with the milk. The creamery operator said, "Not taking your milk unless you drink a glass of it first." Everybody heard about the day that Stemple wouldn't drink his own milk. So the creamery operator said, "Nope, unless you drink it from now on." A remarkable thing happened. Stemple started bringing clean milk from then on because he would have to drink a glass of it before turning it in. Now, so he had built his little reputation there, but and everyone knew it because people didn't keep their mouths shut about something like that. Well, as an older teenager, as a young teen, I got a horse, and she had a colt, and that colt is 2 years old. It hadn't been gelded, so it was a young stallion. Stemple had a Shetland mare, and he asked me if my young stallion had reached maturity. I told him, I don't know, it's only 2 years old, you know. And every day for a week or two, somehow Stemple's little Shetland mare got away, traveled a mile, and came to my place to visit the young stallion. And you're going, can't he lock that horse up? Until I realized he was letting it out, okay, in hopes that he could get a freebie and get a free colt out of the deal for himself. Well, in Psalm 32, verse 2, we read, "Blessed is the man against whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit." That's the English Standard Version. In other words, who are you trying to fool here? Who are you trying to trick? You know, this is, you're not going to get by with anything. In Proverbs 22 and verse 1, Proverbs 22:1, "A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver or gold." Being rich is one thing, but having a good name, we're reading, is far better. It's far more important to preserve your self-worth. So lesson number 8 is avoid guile, avoid deceit, preserve your good name. Number 9 was Leo Reiner, another German. This one was a Catholic. He had 13 children. Their names started with the letter J. And in fact, his grandson is now my tenant on the farm in Minnesota. And we got along well. Not everybody did. Leo's mouth never stopped running. He always had something to say. And when a young man, I started farming, I rented land from Leo. He was getting old, so I rented 80 acres from him. And he was a wonderfully generous fellow. He'd give you the shirt off his back if he thought it would help you. He was easy for me to work with. He was the first person in the neighborhood with a 4-wheel drive and a livestock trailer. So he would haul livestock for my dad. And he was always ready for action, or at least an answer. And there was something that everyone could count on. Leo was never speechless. He had a response for everything. Let's take a look at 1 Peter 3:15. In 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is within you in meekness and fear. Leo was ready for anything. He would always have an answer. Whether it's right or wrong, he had an answer. How many of us are prepared if somebody asks us a hard question? Had that happen to me more than once, but some years ago, a teacher next door to me in my class, next to my classroom, and we were each having a prep period, and she came into my doorway and stood in the doorway and said, I'm going to church with you this weekend. Nobody has ever said that to me before, much less another teacher in school. And I'm sitting there in my desk, flabbergasted. Okay. Caught me off guard. Didn't know what to say. She says, well, if you don't want me to go. I said, no, you're welcome. I just never had anybody ask me before. I said, you do know that we go to church on Saturday. She goes, I can go to church on Saturday. Okay, here's where we meet. And here's when we meet. When my wife and I got there that Sabbath, she was already there. She comes up and says, you neglected to tell me you were the pastor. Delightful relationship. She comes about once or twice a year, maybe. But she's in for the social end of it, not for the religious end of it. But we have to be ready. We never know what's going to hit or what's going to come. So lesson number 9, be ready always for an answer of the hope that lies within you. Are we able to respond when somebody throws a question to us? That was number 9. Number 10, Ernst Easterhoff, Ernie. He was in the Army under command of General Patton during World War II. He was engaged to my dad's cousin before he went for 4 years in the military and drafted and got away before he got married. When he got home, he married my dad's cousin. Our farms were immediately next to each other. My dad and Ernie, they each had 4 boys. We grew up half a mile apart. And so, in fact, most of the neighbors' families had 4 boys. It seems baby boomers. And when you get that many boys together, we played softball in the spring, football in the late summer and the fall. In the winter, when the hay mows were clean, we could play basketball up in the hay barn. We got together a lot. Well, we were playing football on a Sunday afternoon in the fall, whether it was August or September. And one of the cows, and this is on the neighbor's, Ernie Diestrau's farm, and one of the neighbors, or one of the cows in the pasture got scared and knocked down the electric fence. Because you got boys out there playing football. And it was an electrified fence. So there's a pulse of electricity going through it. Well, once the fence is down, all the cows can get out. Now you got real troubles. They'll be out wrecking the crops, getting on the road, and they might get hurt. Well, We knew we had to fix the fence, but we also knew somebody had to run home from the pasture and unplug the fencer so the electric jolts weren't coming through. Well, it just so happens that Ernie was walking out to see the boys at the time, and they said something shocking. No need to run home, I'll just fix the fence right here. That was insane. Nobody touches electric fence. Well, we saw it with our eyes, and everybody who was there that day, I suspect if they're alive today, they can still remember the experience. Ernie picks up the electric wires, because it had come apart, picked up live electric wires with the electric fence jolt, and we could see his hands jumping as he fixed the fence and put the wires back together. Now, none of us are ever crazy enough to do something like that. But, you know, for us, that was impossible. It's not rational. Of course, he fought under General Patton. I guess he could do anything, right? Fought in the Italy campaign, went up into Germany. He was the German translator for his company of men because he grew up speaking German. In Mark 9:23, Jesus said, all things are possible to him that believes. It's repeated told in Matthew 19:26. Jesus beheld him and said, with men this is impossible, with God all things are possible. We have limited thinking. Most of us limit our thinking to what we used to do rather than what's possible. Now, having said that, I'm not about to go fix any electric fences. I know my brother is so apprehensive about electric fence that the joke is he will go to the county power supply and pull the switch so that there's no power in the county while he fixes a fence. Because there's nothing worse than you're fixing a fence and your brother sees that the plug is pulled out on the fencer and plugs it in while you're doing the fix. Apparently that had happened to him. Not too fond of that. But lesson 10 that we learned from Ernie was all things are possible with God. Now, so in other words, go beyond what we think is possible. There are things, even though we think it's not possible, it is possible. Number 11 is George Dake. He was a brother to the other Dake that I mentioned. Well, he had one arm, had lost it in a piece of machinery, and despite having one arm, he farmed with horses. And he got into a dispute with one of his neighbors. A nasty argument, heated words were exchanged. And George Dake promised in front of witnesses that one day, he said when his neighbor died, he would dig his grave an extra foot deep. That was his final remark. And as life and chance would happen, about 30 years later, the neighbor in fact did die first. Well, my dad tells this story because my dad was a young fellow at the time, and he was called upon to help with a crew to dig the grave in the cemetery. It was January in Minnesota. Everybody brought a pick and a shovel, and they swung a pick and chipped out a piece of ice or soil about the size of a quarter, and then another one, and then another, until they get below the frost line, and then they could dig. And by the time they got the hole pretty deep, this was 30 years after the neighborhood blow up from Walt Dake and the neighbor, that, George Dake. And George says to the other guys, you can go ahead now, I'll finish up. Well, the young men thought nothing of it. They weren't around 30 years before to know about the exchange. They were happy to go home if one person was willing to finish the job. After the funeral, it's only a mile or so from neighborhood cemetery, a mile or so from where I grew up. When it came time to lower the coffin into the grave, the undertaker discovered that the grave was dug too deep for his equipment to lower the coffin into the grave. Pull it back up again, shovel dirt back into the grave, and then the word got out. Old George's vow to dig that grave an extra foot deep for the neighbor that he wasn't fond of. If you take a look at Psalm 94 and verse 1, Psalm 94 and verse 1. O Lord God, you whom vengeance belongs, O God, to you whom vengeance belongs, shine forth. That's the Amplified Version. Romans 12:19 says it this way, Romans 12:19, avenge not yourselves, beloved, but give place to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance belongs to me, I will recompense, says the Lord. Well, the psalmist acknowledged that vengeance belongs to God. And notice when it's said in Psalm 94, it was repeated for emphasis. When you see that in the Hebrew writings and they repeated it, that's a especially important emphasis. So let's take a look at the example of George Dake, One-Armed George. It's lesson 11. Let God take care of the vengeance. We haven't enough to concern ourselves with our own lives. Number 12, probably one of my favorite, was Ozzie Olsen. 3 miles away in near the Danish creamery, Danish neighborhood. The Germans didn't always mix with the Danes, but they were a few miles away. But Ozzie, he liked everybody, whether they liked him or not. He trusted everybody. Everybody was his friend. You know, like that, those extreme extroverts. He was a farmer, but on the side he sold farm equipment, like barn cleaners that would rotate in the barn, and dairy barns. He sold silo and loader machines, and he sold grade A milk pipeline systems. He was the field sales guy in case somebody needed to upgrade their equipment. My dad purchased a barn cleaner from Ozzie. What happened was Ozzie brought a barn cleaner out and dumped it off at my dad's place and said, "You're remodeling your barn, you're going to need one of these." My dad said, but how am I going to pay for it? And Ozzie says, "Don't worry about it. I'm sure you'll think of something." And sure enough, we put in the automatic barn cleaner. Same thing happened with a silo and loader. And then we put in a grade A milking pipeline system. And it was many years later. I went to Sabbath services in St. Cloud, Minnesota, 60 miles north of the farm. It was one way, 60 miles. But it's 60 miles from St. Cloud to the Twin Cities. And there was a Bible study that evening after Sabbath services. I wanted to go to that in the Twin Cities. So if I went 60 miles north and then 60 miles to the Twin Cities, then it's 60 miles to get back home again. Well, that's under 200 miles. I could do this. So off I went to church in St. Cloud. Then later for the evening, I went to Minneapolis. But I got home late, and it was about midnight. And I'm about 4 or 5 miles from home, and I got a flat tire. And I didn't have a flashlight. And it's midnight. How do you fix a tire with no light? And then a car drove up behind me, shined his headlights there. It was Ozzie Olsen. And he shined what's he doing out? The guy was 90 years old. What's he doing out at midnight on a Saturday night? And I got my tire changed, and I went to thank him for doing that. And I asked him, "What are you doing out at midnight on a Saturday night?" Well, he was a widower. His wife had died about 20 years before, after they had been married like 40 years. He said, well, he was on his way home from visiting his lady friend at age 90. Okay. In Proverbs 18:24, a man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Now, Ozzie wasn't everybody's best friend, but he was genuinely friendly to everyone. And as a result, he was well thought of. He was blessed with a happy disposition and a long life. So lesson 12 is to have friends, you must show yourself friendly. So what godly principles can we learn from our neighbors? Well, these are a summary, and I have more neighbors. But from Big Eddie's story, Big Eddie Miller, lesson 1 is a soft answer turns away wrath. You don't have to make things worse. In that case, the guy just went home. That was pretty soft, not going to argue. Lesson 2, also from Big Eddie, don't miss a good opportunity to keep your mouth shut. I mean, sometimes you have to contain your anger. It's not worth being expressive in all circumstances. Lesson 3, we learned from Cliff Benson. Live your dreams. Everybody needs dreams. dreams and hope. But place your hope and confidence in God. In other words, don't misplace those dreams. Lesson 4, have a vision for the future. Think big, beyond yourself. In our case, we have to keep our eye on the prize, the family of God and the kingdom of God. And thinking big, I learned that from Ray and Ralph Geyer. Lesson 5, from Walt Dake, old Walt, live simply and tend to your own affairs, not as a busybody in other people's lives. In other words, look to our own interests first, rather than straightening everybody else out. Lesson 6, as I learned from Art Otto, the workaholic, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. If you're going to put some effort into it, make it worth it. Make it worth it. Lesson 7, I learned from Ed Diesterhoff, diligently follow the law all the time. Cross the T's, dot the I's. Old Ed was famous for that. Diligently making sure everything was done legally. Lesson 8 from Stemple Johnson, I learned avoid guile, avoid deceit, preserve your good name. Sometimes the lesson we teach is the bad example we're leaving. I always got along with Stemple, but he taught that valuable lesson, preserve your good name. Lesson 9 from Leo Reiner, the guy with 13 kids and never stopped talking. Be ready always for the answer of the hope that lies within you. Be ready, have an answer. When somebody surprises you with a question, are you well-founded enough on Scripture that you're able to respond? I have some wild stories that I can tell you, because as you might imagine, I get some crazy calls from time to time. I got one this week while I'm at summer camp. And from the guy, the guy was a nutcase, and I put that in the phone log, so if it ever calls again, it'll say nutcase on there. Because there are people like that who think that biblical references apply to places in the United States instead of in the Middle East, and that Zion and Jerusalem are really in Arizona, and that all of the people that don't follow him are going to go through the tribulation, and that we're all going to run out of gas and food in July if we don't listen to him, among other things. I mean, just so how do you answer somebody like that? It's quite a dance. Lesson 10 from Ernie Diesterhoff, the guy that put the electric wire together with his bare hands while it was on. Lesson 10, all things are possible with God. Just because we can't think it can't be done doesn't mean something can't be done. Lesson 11 from George Dake, the one-armed guy, let God take care of the vengeance. We don't have to take vengeance ourselves. Usually it'll always take care of itself. And lesson 12 from good old Ozzie Olson, to have friends, you must show yourself friendly. Now I'm going to ask a question. What kind of a neighbor are we? What will our legacy be in 50 or 60 years from now when a younger person recounts his or her experience with us? And will we show up on a list of neighborly experiences, say, remember that time when I met so-and-so? Because remember Proverbs 22, verse 1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver or gold. So let's learn from the wisdom of our neighbors, biblical wisdom from secular neighbors. Let's be the kind of neighbors from whom others can gain wisdom in a positive way. Let's guard our good name. Let's demonstrate the love of God by keeping His commandments, to love God and to love our neighbors as ourselves.